Hello, this is NEMYRIALIVE, and we continue our broadcasting from Kiev. And we are very happy and proud that our guest today is Tong Zhao. He is one of the world's leading experts on nuclear deterrence, strategic stability, and security issues in Asia Pacific region. He is a senior fellow in the nuclear policy program in the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Formerly based in Beijing, he now works out of Washington, D.C. His research focuses on China's nuclear strategy, hypersonic weapons, missiles defense, and US-China strategy dialogue. His articles have appeared in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, The Atlantic, Arms Control Today, and many others prominent platform. His latest publication, Political Drivers of China's Changing Nuclear Policy, has become a key contributor to a global debate on the risk of a new arms race. Mr. Zhao, hello, and thank you so much to be with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Mr. Zhao, let's start from the very beginning, from the China's nuclear policy. You argue that China no longer sees nuclear weapons solely as a defensive tool. What triggered this shift in perspective?
I think there are two levels. One is at the political level, the Chinese current leadership sees broader coercive value in nuclear weapons. And under his role, the Chinese Missile Force, the PLA Rocket Force, has adopted a new mission statement that includes the mission to achieve strategic counterbalance. I think what that means is the leadership believes that a larger and more powerful nuclear arsenal can somehow provide China with broader foreign policy and security coercive leverage, and therefore could compel Chinese enemies to adopt softer approaches towards China across the board. So the leadership believe that nuclear weapons can help shape the overall China-US bilateral relationship in a direction that is more favorable to Chinese strategic interests. And secondly, at the operational level, I think the Chinese nuclear weapons are still primarily serving the goal of a secure second strike in order to deter a nuclear attack. But the military in China is increasingly worried about limited nuclear threats. They are watching US development of low-yield tactical nuclear weapons, and somehow they convince themselves that China also needs to have the capability to manage a small-scale nuclear conflict. So that's why the military is also developing theater range precision nuclear weapon systems with perhaps lower yield nuclear warheads. And that gave the military the capability to manage a limited nuclear exchange and how to manage further escalation in case a small nuclear exchange escalates into a larger and more comprehensive nuclear war.
What is the main danger when nuclear strategy is increasingly shaped by the military and industrial elite rather than professional experts?
Well, one danger is now there are more military stakeholders that are interested in seeing China invest more into nuclear programs. So China is currently developing a nuclear triad capability, land-based, sea-based, and air-based nuclear weapons. That means multiple military services have a piece in the nuclear cake that includes the Rocket Force, the Air Force, and the Navy. So they all want to advocate for greater government investment into nuclear programs. So there will be more supporters of larger nuclear capability. And the military, they are always driven by how to fight and win wars. So that runs the risk of shifting China's nuclear thinking increasingly towards the direction of fighting and winning nuclear conflict. That would be a major departure from China's traditional emphasis on deterring nuclear conflict. The increasing interest in managing nuclear escalation, I think, reflects this broader shift towards thinking about how to conduct nuclear warfare. The military is also developing capabilities such as launch on warning or launch under attack, which means they will use early warning system to provide the political leadership with the capability to quickly see and track an incoming missile strike and then authorize an immediate nuclear retaliation. But the political leaders, they don't have the time within several minutes to make a nuanced decision on a sophisticated retaliation strategy. So they have to rely more on the military to prepare, to prepare nuclear strike options so they can select from those pre-prepared options. That means the military has greater power to actually shape China's nuclear response options.
Do you believe China is moving towards abandoning its long-standing no first use policy in the foreseeable future?
That's a complicated issue. I think at this political level, China appears still very committed to the general principle of not using nuclear weapons first, because this declaratory policy has served Chinese foreign policy interests over the past decades. It made China appear a responsible nuclear weapon state compared with other countries. And China wants to keep maintaining, keep benefiting from this no first use declaratory policy. And China's overall nuclear capability, despite the recent expansion, is still much weaker than the United States and Russia. China now, according to U.S. government assessments, has about 600 nuclear weapons in total, whereas the operationally deployed American nuclear arsenal is close to 2,000. So it doesn't make sense to Chinese military strategists to want to first escalate a conventional conflict to the nuclear level, because in the nuclear domain, China doesn't have the advantage. The US maintains an obvious advantage. So China actually wants to keep future conflict with the United States below the nuclear threshold. That means China wants its nuclear arsenal to help deter the United States from escalating across the nuclear threshold, so that China can more freely compete with the United States and fight the United States at the conventional level. But there are also some nuances in China's nuclear strategy. If we look at a relatively authoritative military document in 2004, written by leading experts by the Chinese Rocket Force, the document, which is called the Strategy of Second Tier Campaign, it portrays a few scenarios in which China would threaten nuclear use in a conventional war. From China's perspective, that wouldn't necessarily violate no first use, because China was only making a threat. It may not necessarily follow through the threat. But I think that's that's a debatable argument, because from the enemy's perspective, any nuclear threat from China has to be treated as serious as possible. So simply to threaten nuclear first use in a conventional war, I think would at least cause question about whether China is complying with the spirit of a no first use policy. So that undermines the credibility and therefore the reassuring value in a no first use policy.
Let's speak a little bit about strategic stability and United States. You say that US-China dialogue suffers not only from the lack of trust, but also from the absence of shared language. It is very interesting. What could a new foundation for nuclear stability talks look like?
I think sometimes the language matters to China. China recently has become less interested in the term strategic stability between US and China. I think China sees bilateral strategic stability as resembling the nuclear relationship between US and Soviet Union during the Cold War. And that's a relatively equal nuclear relationship in the sense that US and Soviet Union, for the most part during the Cold War, or at least towards the later part of the Cold War, had relatively similar nuclear capabilities. So that's a relatively symmetric nuclear relationship. And that also made it, that contributed, that relatively symmetric nuclear relationship contributed to a bilateral nuclear arms control process. But for China, it refuses to project the US-China current nuclear relationship as a symmetric nuclear relationship, resembling the US-Russia or US-Soviet relationship, nuclear relationship. China, doesn't want to be seen as entering a new Cold War with the United States, and it doesn't want to shoulder the responsibility of symmetric nuclear arms control obligation as implied in a Cold War style symmetric nuclear relationship. So it has been refusing to use the analogy of the Cold War US-Russia relationship to describe its current relationship with the United States. That's, I think, partly why Beijing is increasingly less interested in discussing US-China bilateral strategic stability. But it continues to talk about global strategic stability. So if we want to promote bilateral US-China nuclear talks, perhaps we should use some language that is more broader and more general, such as a strategic security dialogue rather than a strategic stability dialogue.
Do you think it could help to reduce the risk of misperception in Berlin, for example, if we will use this type of communication, as you suggest?
Yes, I think to some extent, the language can increase or decrease the risk of misperception. For us, we just discussed China's problem with bilateral strategic stability with the United States, because that term implies, from China's perspective, an equal responsibility in limiting nuclear programs and negotiating arms control agreements. And China doesn't want an equal responsibility. It sees the United States having a much larger nuclear arsenal, and therefore bearing a special and greater responsibility. So I think it's, in that case, the term bilateral U.S.-China strategic stability creates the misperception in Beijing that it indicates an equal and symmetric responsibility in arms control.
What do you think? How dangerous is the combination of China's nuclear buildup and USA nuclear modernization?
I think it creates a number of uncertainties and risks. Firstly, it's the first time in Chinese history that China is so quickly expanding its nuclear arsenal. For decades, China had maintained a relatively small arsenal of about 200 nuclear weapons. Until 2019, the US government still assessed China to have just a little more than 200 nuclear weapons. But since 2019 to today, the number has almost tripled to over 600. So that's a very abrupt and fast expansion. The problem is this entire process of nuclear buildup is extremely secretive. The Chinese government hasn't provided any information about how many more nuclear weapons China is planning to build. What's the end goal of the current Chinese nuclear buildup? And what's the reason that China is suddenly increasing its nuclear arsenal? What specific security, military, or geopolitical objectives is China trying to achieve with a larger and more diverse nuclear arsenal? Without basic answer, without answers to these basic questions, it easily raises doubts in many countries, including the United States and its allies, because they see Chinese nuclear buildup as totally unlimited and open-ended. So many American strategists worry that China is aiming to achieve nuclear parity with the United States. And that's why the United States today is so concerned about facing an unprecedented threat from two nuclear near peers simultaneously, Russia and China. And the fact that Russia and China are indeed working together on some nuclear-related capabilities, including missile defense and early warning systems. And the two countries are increasingly conducting joint patrols of their heavy bombers, further increased American concern about the threat of two nuclear near peers. Some American strategists even worry that China might want to develop a larger arsenal than the United States, and that China may want to have the capability to conduct disarming first strike against American nuclear forces. And China may want to, change its nuclear policy towards first use. All of those concerns cannot be answered because China refuses to provide basic information and explanation about its nuclear buildup. So the consequence is very broad. It is not only prompting the United States to reconsider its nuclear policy. The United States has been reducing its nuclear arsenal since the end of the Cold War. But now the US is about to reverse this process. There's an increasing consensus in Washington that United States needs to reinvest and revitalize its nuclear capability. And if the New START treaty expires in February 2026, it's very likely that US will upload the reserve warheads into current delivery systems and start increase the number of deployed nuclear weapons. it causes the United States to renuclearize. It also increases the threat perception of many other countries across the world, Japan, South Korea, and many NATO countries and non-NATO countries such as Australia and others. They are worried about the broader arms race implications of China's nuclear buildup. They also feel that this buildup may be driven by a more ambitious and aggressive Chinese foreign policy or global design. So they need to have a stronger military capability to counter Chinese military ambition. So it has global implications for stability and security, and has, I think, contributed to arms race dynamics in many regions across the world. And the second important implication and risk is it increases the risk of nuclear conflict. Now China has a more diverse and more sophisticated nuclear arsenal. It has provided China with more options to use nuclear signaling and including coercive signals in a conventional war. So China has the capability to use nuclear weapons in a limited way against military facilities. It can afford conducting a prolonged nuclear conflict because it can now use nuclear weapons and conduct escalation in a gradualistic manner. And the fact that China is adopting a new nuclear posture, such as launch warning, also increase the risk of false alarm, leading to an incidental and unnecessary nuclear conflict.
The next important theme is missiles, defense, and space. You have written that China views space-based missile defense as a precursor to a disarming first strike. Why is the space element particularly alarming for Beijing?
China is, for a long time, China worried that the U.S. Homeland missile defense system is aimed at neutralizing China's nuclear deterrence. China always adopts worst-case scenario planning. So its assumption is in a nuclear conflict between U.S. and China, the U.S. will conduct a disarming first strike to destroy as many Chinese nuclear weapons as possible. And because of America's large nuclear arsenal, it is likely that only a small number of Chinese nuclear weapons would survive a comprehensive American disarming strike. And therefore, even a small-sized U.S. homeland missile defense system might be able to completely intercept the Chinese retaliation with a small number of survived nuclear weapons. So China has been very sensitive to U.S. development of homeland missile defense capability as a result. And it is very concerned about the recent American interest in space-based interceptors because they think space-based interceptors are very capable of intercepting intercontinental range ballistic missiles. And they may be able to conduct a boost phase interception, which would disable China from releasing decoys and other penetration technologies to neutralize U.S. missile defense. In other words, space-based interceptors may make it harder for China to penetrate U.S. homeland missile defense. So I think that's why China has a special concern about such capabilities. And in addition, China worries that United States development of space-based interceptors might contribute to other offensive space capabilities, because the interceptors may also be able to be used as anti-satellite weapons. So again, China uses, I think, worst case scenario thinking to speculate about American intent, and therefore is very troubled by space-based missile defense systems.
Is any realistic pathway to mutual limits or agreements on missiles defense system given current technologies and politics?
In theory, I think it is increasingly possible and actually necessary to have a missile defense dialogue, if not arms control agreement. Because China itself is developing a very ambitious plan to develop and deploy multi-layered missile defense systems in China. And China has been very aggressively conducting research on missile defense systems, and has already successfully developed a number of missile defense technologies, including low altitude end phase or terminal phase missile defense systems like HQ-9. It has also developed mid-cost, medium range, and intermediate range missile defense interceptors. The HQ-19 that was publicly displayed recently is one example of that. And China reportedly has developed even a longer range, a more strategic level missile defense system that may be able to defend against ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. And China, has developed 3 large ICBM silo sites in northwestern part of the country, which means China needs missile defense systems to protect these strategic nuclear and command and control communication facilities. So missile defense is becoming increasingly important for China's security objective. So that means US and China are increasingly, there is less asymmetry when it comes to missile defense. That, I think, can serve as a foundation for some negotiations or discussions, at least, on missile defense issue. China, is worried about US missile defense, and I think for sure United States also worries about the implications of Chinese missile defense. So the two sides can certainly sit down and discuss their mutual concerns and find some common solutions. So the obstacle is, I think, mostly at the geopolitical level. China, hasn't been waiting to discuss bilateral arms control issues when it comes to strategic capabilities of any kind with the United States, being it nuclear, being it missile defense, being it space-based capabilities, or strategic cyber capabilities. So it has more to do with a strategic culture of secrecy and wanting to protect Chinese military capabilities and state secrets, and this deeply embedded suspicion about arms control talks and transparency and verification measures, and whether they can really contribute to Chinese security, and whether they may be abused by a more powerful country to take advantage of China. That a suspicion I think is a main obstacle for discussion on missile defense issues.
In your works, you pay special attention for hypersonic weapons and new arms race. You have warned that hypersonic weapons create a strategic trap. By the way, what does it mean, the strategic trap, and why do they undermine deterrence predictability?
I think one important technical feature of hypersonic missiles, meaning boost glider missiles or hypersonic cruise missiles, is they can change their trajectories during flight. I think that causes important challenges to some long nuclear practices, such as launch on warning or launch under attack. Both United States and China now have capabilities to conduct launch on warning, but launch on warning is based on the capacity to precisely predict what's the target, what's the intended target of an incoming missile strike. But if now countries have maneuverable missile systems that can change flight trajectory, including during the terminal phase of their flight, that would make the other side much harder to predict the intended targets and causes misunderstanding. And this problem is further exacerbated by the fact that in Northeast Asia, America's main nuclear rivals, China, Russia, and North Korea, those three countries are located together. And Russia has some nuclear weapon storage facilities not far from its border with China. And if we look at the Chinese-North Korean border, North Korea reportedly has ICBM facilities not far from the border, and on the Chinese side of the border, China also has ICBM units. So if the Chinese early warning detects a launch of US hypersonic missiles towards Northeast Asia, and those missiles can maneuver, can change direction and trajectories during flight, how can Chinese early warning system know for sure whether those American missiles are aiming at North Korea or China or Eastern Russia? So that uncertainty increases the risk of misunderstanding and overreaction. And especially under launch on warning posture, the compressed decision-making time, that the fact that political leaders only have several minutes to assess the situation and make a decision, I think further increase the risk of making mistakes.
Do you see any viable chance for international agreements on hypersonic technologies, or is that window already closed?
Right now, there has been very little discussion on controlling or limiting the development or deployment of hypersonic missiles, not least because this is a cutting-edge technology and countries are very reluctant to share information about their capabilities. And the major powers, they all understand that future missiles will be very fast and very nimble, being able to maneuver. So they believe that hypersonic missiles represent the direction of a future military revolution. So they hope that this technology will have a great future potential to deliver important military benefit. So they don't want to foreclose the opportunity to exploit this new technology. They still envision a lot of future military utility. But the good news is hypersonic missiles are so expensive to develop and manufacture. So it is unlikely that major powers can afford to procure a large number of them. So for the foreseeable future, they will remain a niche military capability, and that might be able to somehow reduce the risks that they are bringing.
Let's speak a little bit about Taiwan and conflict risk. You have warned of an informational echo chamber surrounding Taiwan inside China's decision-making circles. What does it mean, echo chamber, and how real is the danger of miscalculation?
A major challenge facing the Taiwan Strait situation is on the Chinese side. We have a closed system that is not democratic, which means on the issue of Taiwan, there is very little room for necessary policy discussion and debate. The government insists that China has to unify Taiwan at all costs, and no one is allowed to raise basic questions about this objective. What does it mean to achieve unification at all costs? Right? That's a slogan. That's not a rational policy, right? Because nothing is worth achieving at all costs, right? It doesn't make sense. It's not logical. But on such key issues, there is no room for raising basic questions. For example, no one is allowed to challenge why China is under a hurry to promote unification, right? The current government has shifted the focus of its policy from preventing independence towards promoting unification. And the leadership is demonstrating a sense of urgency to make progress on unification. But we don't understand where does this sense of urgency come from? Why do we have to push this issue when there are already so many domestic and international challenges today? And for sure, to promote unification will cause, regional concerns and turbulence, and it will create a lot of obstacle for China's more important longer term goal of becoming a prosperous nation, right? The Chinese people, they prioritize greater economic development and raising of living standard. We don't really know how the general public in China think about or compare the importance of economic development and national unification. Maybe they value raising living standard higher than achieving unification. But there is no public polls being conducted. We don't know how the general public think about these issues. And more importantly, the government insists that we have to maintain the military option to achieve unification, and that's the fundamental source of military competition and arms race in the region. Because if China insists the option of military takeover of Taiwan, of course, the United States and other countries who disagree with this option would have to prepare to counter Chinese military operation, and that's what is driving arms race both at the conventional level and all the way to the nuclear level. And the logic behind military unification simply isn't there, right? China has been promoting the principle of resolving international disputes through peaceful means and political negotiations to every other country. But now when it comes to Taiwan, China refuses this principle of peaceful negotiation. And it argues that because Taiwan is an internal matter, it is not an international dispute, and therefore the peaceful principle doesn't apply. But that doesn't make sense, because if China is willing to settle international disputes with foreign countries with peaceful means only, why does China insist it has to use force against its own claimed brothers and sisters in Taiwan, right? China claims, Taiwanese people are brothers and sisters of the mainland people. And now you want to use force against your own brothers and sisters, and you have committed not to use force against the foreigners, against the strangers, right? That there is no logic behind the policy of insisting a military option. But more fundamentally, the reason Taiwanese people in recent decades are increasingly less interested in unification is because they don't like Chinese political system, right? They don't want to live in an authoritarian system. They have watched how the authoritarian system is, depriving people of basic freedom and liberty and rights. So if China really wants to promote unification at all costs, it should first reform its own political system, right? But that's something the Chinese government completely rejects and doesn't allow people to even mention it, right? So there are so many, internal conflicts and tensions and incoherence in China's own thinking and logic behind its Taiwan policy. And that, is the fundamental reason that peaceful unification is so hard to achieve. And the general public on the two sides of the Taiwan Strait increasingly have developed different views on everything, including basic facts, because they live in two different information systems. And in mainland China, only certain types of history are allowed to be taught at school and to be discussed in public. So over a long time, that has made people from two sides develop divergent views on basic factual issues that further contributes to the difficulty of talking with each other, because they have no foundation for a constructive and meaningful discussion. And therefore, military option increasingly becomes, I think, the only way if China, insists to achieve unification in the near-term future. So that's why I'm increasingly worried about the Taiwan Strait situation.
What do you think? What could effectively prevent escalation in Taiwan Strait? Maybe some military balance, maybe diplomacy, maybe new security architecture, if we just look for international aspect of this situation.
Well, the Chinese strategy is to quickly build up its comprehensive national power to basically convince Taiwan that it has no choice but to unify with the mainland and to adopt a political arrangement under Chinese terms. And it is to convince Taiwan that it would be futile to try to resist unification. It is to try to convince international friends of Taiwan, United States, Japan, and other countries that it would be futile for them to try to intervene, even with military means, because China would have a greater military capability in the Asia-Pacific region to defeat any international intervention. So the Chinese strategy is built on the premise of acquiring a very formidable military capability to dissuade international intervention and to compel Taiwan to accept voluntary unification. So it's very hard to negotiate arms control agreements or a new peace regime because the Chinese strategy depends on a superior military capability and the capability to win. So I think, as I said, we don't have good diplomatic solutions. The fundamental challenge is China insists on the right to resolve the problem through military means. Maybe the international community should work together to promote the common sense principle of not using force to change territorial status quo. Right? I think that's a common sense principle that should be easily understood and should appear, naturally acceptable to all members of the international community. But we need, other members of the international community to uphold and support and promote this common sense principle. But right now, because the international situation is so chaotic, there are so many conflicts and challenges across the world, the international community is not demonstrating the political interest and resolve to jointly promote basic common sense principles to regulate the behaviors of major powers like China. And that's why I think, we may actually see increased military tensions in the Asia Pacific.
And in that, let's speak a little bit about the arms control. Sorry, maybe it will be a long question, but I try to put all in one. That during the Cold War, you say about Cold War at the beginning of your interview, we have a bilateral arms control, for example, United States and Soviet Union. Do you think that now we will have trilateral arms control, for example, USA, Russia, and China? But if you look for the China, we see that China didn't indicate its readiness to be part of this big arms control. And what do you think, in that case, what could be the role of war in Ukraine and, for example, on the Middle East for general situation with this control? Sorry, it is too many questions in one, but nevertheless, yeah, it's just about the general picture, I think so.
Well, it increasingly makes sense for US, Russia, and China to conduct trilateral arms control talks, because China's nuclear capability is increasing very quickly. And if we look at the operationally deployed nuclear weapons, according to international assessments, China may develop more than 1,000 nuclear weapons in the next 10 years, and may reach the number of 1,500 by 2035. So that means US, Russia, and China may have similar numbers of operational nuclear warheads. Of course, there are many qualifications to that prediction, because whether and to what extent the United States will further increase its nuclear arsenal in response to China and Russia in the near-term future is uncertain. But if we assume US and Russian arsenals remain the same, then by 2035, the three powers may have similar numbers of operational nuclear warheads. And that means it's sensible for them to discuss nuclear arms control issues together. And this would actually benefit China because in a trilateral nuclear arms control setting, China and Russia have similar interests. They share similar concerns about the United States. And China lacks experiences in arms control talks, in nuclear arms control talks, so it can benefit from Russia's experiences. So if China joins a trilateral arms control, I think it actually makes it easier for China to defend its interests than in the U.S.-China bilateral arms control agreement, a negotiation. But somehow Beijing decided during the first Trump administration to reject the format of trilateral arms control. And that decision appeared to be made at a relatively high level, which means after the decision was made, Chinese strategists and experts no longer wanted to entertain the idea of trilateral arms control anymore. So that door is basically shut. Unless President Trump personally raises this issue with the Chinese paramount leader directly and repeatedly, then China may be able, that high level American attention may be able to make China reconsider its approach. But other than that, it's hard to imagine China joining trilateral arms control talks. I think what Ukraine war and Russia's invasion has reminded China is the increasing possibility of nuclear conflict. And the war in the Middle East, including the current conflict between Israel and Iran, is also caused by the risk of Iran's development of nuclear weapons. And depending on how the war develops, maybe the conflict could prompt Iran to further develop its nuclear capability. In that case, the risk of a nuclear conflict in the Middle East in the future will also grow. So perhaps this increased concern about nuclear conflict might remind China of the necessity to at least talk about measures that would reduce the risk of nuclear war. China's adoption of long-term warning posture is a policy that could increase the risk of nuclear war. And China's increasing emphasis on rapid response of nuclear forces also makes nuclear war more likely to happen than before. So maybe the major powers can discuss measures that would give them more time to evaluate a situation in a conflict and less pressure to make quick decisions regarding nuclear weapons. Maybe they should all reduce their reliance on long-term warning to preserve their nuclear deterrence. So they could introduce changes to their long-term warning policies, making them less likely to cause incidental nuclear use. Maybe they can agree not to use kinetic or non-kinetic, including cyber means, to interfere with each other's command control and early warning systems. That could reduce the risk of misunderstanding and overreaction in a conflict. And transparency, I think, is ultimately necessary to reduce nuclear risk and also to contain nuclear arms race. I think U.S. can and U.S. allies can further explain to Beijing why China's secretive nuclear expansion program is forcing other countries to react and respond, and their reactions and responses would then undermine China's own security. So the ultimate consequence for China is negative. So I think the room to have that type of discussion, taking into consideration the developments and dangers of conflicts in other regions in Eastern Europe and in the Middle East, and the increasing risk of military conflicts in the Eastern Asia, could, I think, highlight to China the importance of having such discussions in the near-term future.
Mr. Zhao, thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you.